Reading that gospel that we've just heard, I experienced one of those rare instances which relate precisely to a song, when particularly in the second paragraph, Jesus speaks to the master of the feast to which he'd been invited, about who he should invite and ask people to dine with him. So if you just cast your mind back to Vagabonds by Stuart Townsend, he'll describe those whom Jesus should suggest should be invited. Vagabonds, another name perhaps for rough sleepers, perhaps the poor who Jesus speaks about. Don't belongs, perhaps not as clearly identified with the crippled, lame and blind in the gospel, but certainly and sadly the don't belongs of today's success-motivated society. And there are many. So this particular choice of hymn for once was made easy. So when you get home, Google it, it's quite easy to get, or Spotify it, or what do people use nowadays? Whatever music app you've got, and just have a look at the words. I think you might find yourself described there in at least one of those categories. Those for whom we are told there is room at the table. So an easy task for choosing at least one of today's hymns. There is also that first paragraph in today's reading to consider. So let me remind you of some of it. Jesus said in the parable he told, when you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, don't sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by the host. And the host has invited both of you. May come forward and say, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you'll move and take the lowest place. It reminds me of that famous phrase, pride comes before a fall. So be careful what places you choose at a feast. Having to move down the table, think of yourself better than others, would thus be a fall in grace or status. So at one level, we see in this parable a warning against pride or arrogance. Pride was also one of the apocryphal 7 deadly sins. And not without good reason, pride can be deadly in its consequences and all that can lead from that. The spin-offs, if you like. Jane Austen didn't title one of her classic novels Pride and Prejudice without good reason. One naturally develops from the other, and prejudice can be deadly, particularly where faith or religion is concerned. You want to go to turn on your news programme, and most every day hear an incident of racial hatred reported, often issuing in death or mass murder. But pride can go much further, and the stupidity of mere snobbery. Pride can create a lot of hurt and can precipitate anger. So clearly, there's more here in Jesus' teaching than merely social etiquette, how to avoid being embarrassed at a party. As is often the case, there are much deeper levels of teaching in this parable than first appears. Luke, in particular, has many passages which include images of eating, especially celebratory feasts. Immediately following today's gospel, in the same chapter of a parable about a wedding banquet in which inviting guests, each in turn make their excuses why they can't come. They are, in short, too distracted by worldly concerns to have lost focus on God's concerns. The master of the feast instructs his servants to bring in others from the highways and byways. And in the next chapter, chapter 15, we see the parable of the prodigal son, at the end of which we have a celebratory feast. Celebration for the return of the lost son. Now the end of the book, following Jesus' resurrection, near the end, the conclusion of the journey to Emmaus is a meal at which the disciples recognize Jesus. And we could go on. There are many others, feeding the 5,000, the Last Supper, and so on. So what are the gospel writers trying to tell us? Apart from the obvious connection of communion with Jesus in the Eucharist, which we celebrate at this service, it holds a promise of heaven, a dwelling in the presence of God on the throne of the heavenly banquet, a promised reward to the Jews, a promise to Christians, followers of Christ, prefigured in his own resurrection. This was what all the Jews longed for, endless celebrations in God's own banqueting hall, sharing the most sumptuous foods possible, which represent God's blessing bestowed on them, the ultimate reward for the faithful. This assumption of reward for good observance, for being a good Jew, makes more sense of Jesus' words, which is the main core of the teaching which he offers at the meal. Having noticed how some guests automatically chose places of honor at the table without being offered them, the parable is cast in a different light. They immediately take places of honor which they assume are theirs by right. As good Jews, as strict observers of the law, they must have these places of honor. The parable criticizes these assumptions by likening this meal to the heavenly banquet. Having done, they presume, favor with the master of the law of the banquet, purely on their own judgment. A clear teaching, even then as now, was that it is God who judges, therefore who are we to condemn? It's a warning against looking down on others, as the Pharisees who had a high-born opinion of themselves did. We can presume nothing in God's eyes. We have no right to assume superiority over others, regardless of who they are. A clear warning against pride and prejudice. And this warning against pride and prejudice is underlined in those final 3 verses when Jesus said to the Pharisees who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return, and you will be repaid. Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." A temptation in this gospel reading is to focus on that middle section, the parable, rather than the beginning and the end. Because here we see a danger of taking things out of context. These 4 sentences, verse 1, 12, 13 and 14, rarely drive home the meaning of the message contained in that parable. Those final verses leave us with a question ringing in our ears. Something to think about. Who would you invite to your special meal? Would you ever think of those you perhaps inadvertently at times look down on, as lower perhaps, socially, religiously, or intellectually than yourself? And in answering this question, look at a meal as an occasion, as a life celebration, life shared with others, a meal shared life now with all who have a bearing at the heavenly banquet, a life in the hereafter. In God's heavenly banquet, we are all invited. If you remember those words from the hymn, come to the feast, there is room at the table. God makes room for all who do not presume to sit at the head of the table. So just have a look at those words when you get home. I think you'll find yourself there somewhere. Come to the feast, there is room at the table, and we're all invited to the Lord's table today, whether to receive bread and wine or receive a blessing which Rob will offer. Thank you.